Hi, people. Welcome back to the second week of Small Group Sundays. I'm just happy that you guys are tuning in. It's been encouraging to hear some of the good conversations that have been coming out of this. Not hearing details around them, but just that there has been some good conversation. And I just want to encourage you guys to, again, push a little bit further and continue to be open and vulnerable wherever your comfort level is with that. That would be really great. This week, we're going to jump into some more things about our lives and kind of the stories around that and the things that shape us and form us. It was interesting. I was listening to. I actually tuned into Joe Rogan's program because he had Dr. Stephen Meyer on, and Stephen is a intelligent design geophysicist and whatever, like a pretty smart guy, and he's written a couple books. The latest one is the Return of the God Hypothesis, and so he was just invited on that show, which is a pretty big audience, to talk about how he sees fine-tuning in the world and in the cosmos, with there being a beginning, and how everything seems to be completely orchestrated in order to create life in this universe. And then he goes into kind of the whole internal stuff around the deep inner workings with the cell, and basically talks about how the whole chicken and the egg thing, you can't have one without the other, and you can't have a beginning of one without the other being present, and how our whole bodies are really fine-tuned to be able to exist. And he kind of wraps things up with just saying everything else that we see as complexity and hyper engineered comes from a mind. And so his whole thesis is that as we see deep complexity and the fine tuning of everything within our world and in our bodies, we can't help but come to a bit of a designer who has designed this. And today I just want to talk a little bit more about not necessarily the biological fine-tuning of our bodies, but that the fact that our psychology, our sociology, our whole like spiritual lives has been fine-tuned by a mind as well as minds, because there's lots of influences, lots of voices that come our way. In fact, in Romans chapter 12, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." I know that's a familiar passage and we hit it quite a bit, but one of the things that's interesting is really around our minds being renewed, transformed, so that we can test and approve of God's will within our lives. It's interesting, David Benner says, what we call I is really a family of many part selves. When that classic statement of like, oh, just be true to yourself, the question is really around like, which self am I supposed to be true to? Because there's lots of things that are true about me, lots of things that influence my identity, lots of things that I will promote in certain settings that are true, but maybe not the truest thing about me. And it might not be wise of me to be true to just a portion of myself, but rather the truest thing about me. And as believers, we would say that that would be God's idea of identity upon us. But it doesn't make sense that we many times take a portion or a sliver and make it our entirety. And I'm just going to point out some of these. If you were to tune back to Wanderlust, where we talked about identity, these are some of those still influences that we highlighted there. And so I'm just going to kind of go through them again, which will then lead us into the deeper questions about which one of these are really forming our lives, and how does that kind of work within our spaces right now. In Genesis, it says, Abraham, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and so became. Believed and so became. Actually, that was in the New Testament, not in Genesis. But the story was in Genesis. Abraham believed what God said to be true, and against all hope believed and so became, and it says the father of us all. Became what his identity, what his calling was really all about. And so the question isn't like, what's coming our way, or how I can believe and then become, because our believing does affect our becoming. It's like, who are we believing? What are we believing? And there's a lot of both active and passive voices in that. Active voices are the external ones that are on display, stuff that other people can see, things that we sometimes promote. These are performance, that is, I am what I do, right? This is questions around what are my jobs, what do I participate in? My possessions, I am what I wear, what I drive, the place that I live. Those form my identity as well. My pleasures, I am what I want, is what that is. The question is, what do I love? What do I delight in? Do I love, food or drink or exercise or blah, 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 whatever it is, they form my identity. And we take our identity from that as well. And then popularity. I am what others think of me. And so I want to present a particular type of person of who I am. And so I want to shape that. I get reinforced by their comments. And that ends up forming my identity. And all of these things may be true. They're not the truest thing about you, right? My job, although it's true, or say me as a father is a true thing about me, it's not the truest thing about me, because the truest actually comes from what God says that I am. And where I go offline on that is when I take the sliver and make it the totality of my identity. There's then passive voices, right? And these are the behind the scenes pressures that we have. Culture, basically. So stories, language, symbols, practices, beliefs, rules, art, etc., all of the external stuff, the tank that we're swimming in as fish. We don't see the water, but the pressure is there. We don't see the external glass of the tank, but it's there. And that whole environment passively seems to influence us, and we might not even recognize it within our lives. And so all these cultural pressures, we just want to be aware of. In fact, Paul says, "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, that they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on your new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body." And so some of the passive voices within our life, the pressures that are put around us with culture, come from the stories that we tell, right? The stories that are forming our culture, that form our worldview. The reality is we are like meaning-making beings, right? We need to have narrative. We need to have a purpose. It forms our life. And depending on what story we tell ourselves will really depend upon kind of where we move forward. For instance, if we just say, oh, I'm just a meat machine and I'm bumping into other things, and my purpose is really just to chew down the algorithms and spit them out over here and engage in all of these other meat machines, that informs how I'm going to live. However, if I say, you know what, I'm a creative image bearer of God, created in God's image by God, that's going to form the story and narrative of my life. And so starting with those worldviews actually makes a difference within our life, because we are formed by the stories we believe. We believe and so become. In fact, Dallas Willard says, we are all a disciple of something or someone. The question isn't whether you are a disciple, but who are you a disciple of? The second kind of passive thing that we kind of walk by, we don't necessarily promote or even think about too much, or sometimes our habits, right? Even Paul talking to the people there, he says, that, however, is not the way of life you learned. You learned. In fact, the things we do something to you. So habits aren't just like these things that kind of hang on to our lives. They actually end up forming you. And so the patterns that we put in, the habits that we make, all end up forming who we are or what we believe ourselves to be. The third one is relationships, right? Relationships. When he's talking to this church, he's talking in plural. He's like yous guysing it. It's not just you individually, but you guys. And so our relationships play a big factor in this. We become who we spend our time with or who we hang out with. We become them. We become just like them. And there's some questions at the tail end of this which are going to be really uncomfortable, because some of the biggest influence in our life is our families. And some of us have been blessed with like great families, and you know what? Although imperfect, they are really a true blessing upon our lives. Others of us have experienced really broken or difficult families, and they do influence us. They end up shaping us, and we end up sometimes adopting things from them, whether it is we just assume that culture of this is what family is, or we resist it and we're like, I'm never going to be like ... They play a big part in our lives. And so when we hit this section in the conversation, this is one that you may want to take a lot of time with, as well as find a real trusted person around this to search out some of those areas. And the fourth one of these passive environmental things is the environment. And that is, we become through our culture. And so just, again, the places that we live end up influencing us. Our environment, towns, wants things for us, but also wants things from us. Bragg Creek specifically, Bragg Creek area, there's things that this whole space gives to us and which shapes us, but it also like demands certain things from us as well. And that always informs what we think of ourselves. And so over the next little bit, I want us to really take to heart Paul's last statements. He says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. When I spent time doing this a month ago in our small groups at the conference I was at, we didn't necessarily form our questions in this way. But when it came to kind of recognizing our identity and finding patterns in our life or things that we shape, that the voices that have shaped our identity, we did spend a whole lot of time together. It was over a few days. I know that this Sunday isn't going to do full justice by any means. So over the next, depending on what your group is and how you make things up with this, you're gonna need at least I would love to say take a half hour, but I don't think that's probably smart. But even if you take 15 minutes and go through these questions, just kind of do some jot point form down all the way through, so that we can kind of look at some of the real live examples of these voices that are influencing us and begin to deconstruct them. And again, I want to have you end at the very end where you begin to ask, what are some of the voices that are the strongest in my life, that end up having the most impact? And what are some of the lies that I've believed because of those voices? And are there areas that I need to then have support or prayer for? And so, again, wherever your comfort level is, when you get to the end and however long you end up spending, I would just encourage you guys to be as open and vulnerable as you possibly can. But please, do share some of these things. It's all part of the stories of who we are, the things we talked about last week. But this goes into maybe some problematic areas of our life where we're trusting these other voices than trusting God's voice. And as we spend time next week, we'll be looking at then what does it mean to, one, be healed from some of these active voices in our life, to be set free from some of them, also to set other people free from some of these pressures and voices in their life as well. And so we'll be looking at what it means to be in a place of surrender, openness, repentance, as well as healing and restoration. And so that's going to be coming next week. So thanks again, and hope you guys have a blessed day. Take care.